bound to a post at the river crossing. She bore a sign that read, "Claim Jumper." The post was a wagon wheel spoke driven into the bank gravel, maybe 4 feet high, and they'd used fence wire instead of rope. That was the part that stayed with me. Rope you could work loose given time. Wire they'd twisted 3 times over with pliers. Whoever did it wanted her there a good long while. I'd come down to the Rincon Ford to water the gray. It was before first light, that flat, colorless hour when shapes don't have edges yet, and everything smells like cold mud and the river. I wasn't looking for trouble. I hadn't been looking for anything in particular for about 2 years by then, which I suppose was its own kind of trouble. She didn't make a sound when she heard me. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people tied to a post in the dark holler or cry or at least shift their weight. She went still. The way a deer goes still, not from fear but from reading you. The sign was cardboard, hanging from twine around her neck. Somebody had used tar to write on it. "Claim Jumper." The letters were big and deliberate, done by a man who wanted them readable from a distance. I sat on the gray for maybe 10 seconds looking at her. She was looking back. Her face was cut 1 cheekbone, clean like a ring had done it, and her wrists were the color of a new bruise from the wire. She was maybe 30, maybe a little more. Dark hair, dark eyes, the kind of still that comes from deciding something. I got down, pulled my belt knife, and started on the wire. She said, "I don't know you." I said, "No." She said, "That sign." I said, "I can read." The wire was stubborn. Whoever had done it had twisted the ends back on themselves. I got 1 loop, then the second, then the third. She didn't help or hinder, just stood there breathing. When the last loop came free, she pulled her wrists apart and pressed them together in front of her and looked at them like they belonged to someone else. I coiled the wire and put it in my saddlebag. Don't ask me why. I just didn't want to leave it there. "You need water," I said. She didn't say yes. She walked to the river and knelt and drank with both hands like an animal drinks, quick and without ceremony, and then she sat back on her heels and looked at the current. I watered the gray. That was how it started. Her name was Celia Vasquez, and she had a claim up on the Mescal bench that had belonged to her mother's second husband, a man named Tate who died of fever the spring before. The claim was recorded in Tate's name at the county seat. Tate had told her on his deathbed that he'd put her name alongside his secondary claimant, the way a man does when he wants to leave something to someone but doesn't quite get around to the paperwork. He hadn't. So when 3 men from a company outfit called the Rafter K rode up and told her the claim was void on account of it being held by a dead man with no legal heirs she could prove, she told them to get off her land. They came back the next day with 4 men and a piece of paper that had a lot of words on it and a stamp at the bottom that looked official even if you couldn't read. She told them again. The 3rd day they came with 7 men, and they did not bring any paper. I found all this out over the next 4 days, a little at a time, the way you learn anything worth knowing, not from being told in one sitting, but from pieces that surface while you're doing something else. She told me about the fever while she was stacking wood. She told me about Tate's mistake while she was mending the split in her boot sole with a needle and waxed cord, not looking at me. She told me about the 7 men in a voice like she was reading a list of provisions, flat and complete, nothing spared but nothing extra either. I brought her back to my camp in the Juniper Flats, which was less a camp than a place I'd stopped moving. I had a canvas lean-to, a good fire ring, coffee, beans, and some salt pork that was getting close to its limit. I had been headed roughly south for no reason I could name. I was 31 days out of Nogales, and I had nowhere particular to be. That had seemed fine at the time. Her cut had needed cleaning. She let me do it without making a production of it. I had a small bottle of carbolic in my kit. I always carry carbolic, old habit, and I used it, and she didn't flinch, but she did close her eyes for a moment, and that told me the cut was worse than it looked. "The men who did this," I said. "Rafter K riders." And the one who gave the order. She was quiet. Then, man named Cordell. He runs the company's land business in this territory. I knew the name. Not personally. But I'd been a deputy in this part of the country for 3 years before I wasn't any more, and names like that get in your ear and stay there the way bad weather stays in your joints. He have law behind him. The sheriff is his cousin's husband. I thought about that. All right, I said. She looked at me. All right, what? I didn't have an answer that was going to satisfy her at that moment, so I didn't try to give one. I got up and put the carbolic away and made coffee. I want to be honest about what I was then, which is something I have not always been good at. I was a man who had stopped, not from exhaustion exactly, though that was part of it, more like a clock that runs down, not broken, just empty of whatever made it go. I had been a fair lawman, not a legendary one, nothing that would get written up, but fair. I'd done the work straight, and I'd taken the bad days as part of the cost, and for a long time that had been enough. Then it stopped being enough, or I stopped being able to make it be enough. I'm not sure which, and I turned in my star and rode south with no plan. The 2 years between that morning and the morning I found Celia at the ford I spent moving, not running from anything, just moving the way a man who's lost his particular gravity moves, working a little here, a little there, never staying. I wasn't unhappy exactly. I was just thin, like paper left in sun too long. She was the first thing in 2 years that made me feel the weight of myself again. I didn't name it that way at the time. At the time I thought I was simply doing what needed doing because there was nobody else to do it. That's what I told myself. I was good at that. On the 5th day, I rode up to the mescal bench alone to look at the claim. It was good land. I don't know what I expected, some hardscrabble patch of gravel maybe, the kind of marginal ground a company outfit would bother with only to prove a point. But it wasn't that. The bench sat about 200 feet above the valley floor, flat and long, with good south exposure and a spring-fed stock tank that had never gone dry in any season Celia knew of. The soil was dark in the low spots. There was timber on the north edge worth something. There was the shell of a frame house Tate had started and not finished, 4 walls, no roof yet, but the bones were square and the foundation stones were cut proper. There was also a man sitting on a horse in the middle of the yard, who was not Celia and not me. He was maybe 45, thick in the chest, wearing a town coat that had no business on a bench claim. He had 2 riders behind him, back far enough to be a message rather than company. I rode up to about 30 feet and stopped. He looked at me the way men like him look at men like me, which is to say he looked through me first, and then, when that didn't land the way he wanted, he looked at me harder. "This is Rafterkay land," he said. "Not yet it isn't," I said. "You're trespassing." "I'm looking." "Looking for what?" "Whether the spring's as good as I heard." He didn't like that. Not the words, the tone. I have a way of being quiet that irritates certain kinds of men, and I've never been able to help it. "Who are you?" he said. I told him my name. It didn't mean anything to him. That was fine. "Who owns this claim?" I said. "It's in probate." "Whose probate?" "Tate's estate." "Tate have any heirs?" He paused just a beat. "No living heirs withstanding." I said. I looked at the frame of the house, looked at the tank, looked at the timber line. "Good land," I said. "Rafterkay intends to acquire it through proper legal process." That how they tied the woman to the post. The rider on his left moved his hand toward his belt. The man in the town coat held 2 fingers up without looking at him, and the rider stopped. She was trespassing. Signs were posted. I looked around at the bench, deliberate, slow, all the way around. "Don't see any signs," I said. "They were posted." I said again. He squared up in the saddle. "I don't know what your interest is in this, friend." "I'm not your friend." That landed. I could see it land. He was a man accustomed to the small social lubricants holding even when the big things broke down, and I had just taken one away. "I'd advise you to think carefully," he said, "about which way you want to stand on this." I looked at him for a moment. Then I turned the gray and rode back down the bench. I didn't hurry, that was important. Celia was at the fire when I got back. She'd made something with the last of the beans and some dried peppers she'd had in her coat pocket, and it smelled better than it had any right to. She handed me a cup of coffee without asking if I wanted one, which I did. I told her what I'd seen and what had been said. She listened with her arms crossed and her eyes on the fire. "Cordell," she said, "it wasn't a question." "Has to be. He'll bring more men next time." "Yes," I said. "And the law won't help." "No." She was quiet for a little while. The fire made the only sound. Out in the flats an owl was hunting, and you could hear the ghost of its wings when it crossed between us and the last of the light. "You don't have any reason to be in this," she said, not accusing, naming a fact. "I know. So why are you?" I thought about the wire. 3 loops twisted back on themselves, done with pliers, the deliberateness of it, the intention to leave her there a long time so she'd be seen, make an example, teach a lesson to anyone else who might think they had standing the company hadn't given them. "Because nobody else is," I said. She looked at me then. It was the first time she'd really looked at me straight on for more than a second, and I felt it the way you feel a door open in a cold room, not the warmth yet, just the change. "That's not enough," she said, "not for what this will cost." "You're right," I said, "it's not." She waited. "There are a few kinds of men," I said. "Ones who do what's wrong, ones who watch, and ones who can't watch. I haven't been able to stop being the third kind, no matter how much I tried." She turned back to the fire. After a while she said, "I can cook and I can work and I don't need to be carried." "I know," I said. "I also shoot." "Good," I said. "I have an extra rifle." I rode to Ocotillo Wells the next morning, which was the nearest town with a telegraph. I had one name in my head, a lawyer in Tucson named Gideon Marsh, who had made a career out of land cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, and who had beaten company outfits twice that I knew of on title disputes not so different from this one. I had helped him once with a witness, nothing large, just putting a scared man on a horse and getting him to the right town at the right time, and he'd told me then, without being specific, that if I ever needed something untangled he would hear me out. I sent him a wire with the key facts in as few words as I could manage, the deed situation, the Rafter K name, the name Cordell, the name of the county and the sheriff's relationship to Cordell, and the woman's name and her connection to Tate. Then I sat on the step of the telegraph office and waited. Ocotillo Wells was not a pretty town. It was a functional town, a livery, a general store, a saloon that also served food, a small hotel with a busted sign out front that had lost 2 of its 4 letters. People came through it going somewhere else. The dust was red and it got into everything. A dog was sleeping under the telegraph office step, and it didn't move when I sat down above it, and it didn't move for the 3 hours I was there, which I respected. The answer came back at 2:30 in the afternoon. 3 words. Wire title record stop. I went back in and told the operator what I needed, and he sent another wire to the county clerk's office, which was 60 miles east, requesting a copy of all filed instruments on the Mescal bench claim going back 8 years. I paid for that in advance, which took most of what I had in my boot, and I told the operator I'd be back in 3 days and to hold anything that came. Then I bought 2 boxes of rifle shells at the general store and rode back. Celia had not been idle. In the day I'd been gone she had patched the lean-to against wind, repaired the hobble on the gray, which I hadn't noticed needed it, found where the nearest water was that didn't require going to the ford, and had put together a rough map on the back of a feed sack showing the approaches to the bench from the valley floor, the places a man could hold, and the places a man couldn't. I looked at the map a long time. "You've done this before," I said. "My father was a border irregular," she said. "Before he died, he thought it was useful for me to know some things." "He was right," I said. She didn't say anything to that, but something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. We ate, and then we went over the map together until the fire burned low, and by the end of it, we had something that at least resembled a plan. I won't tell it in order because it didn't happen in order. Memory doesn't keep a straight line, and neither did those next several days. What I remember is this: the sound of horses in the pre-dawn dark, twice, and both times being nothing deer once, and once a mule that had strayed from a camp somewhere upriver. Celia sleeping on the other side of the fire, wrapped in a blanket she'd produced from somewhere, and waking before I did each morning, and having coffee made before I'd finished pulling my boots on. Riding the bench perimeter for 2 hours one afternoon while she waited below, and counting 7 fresh post holes where someone had begun putting up wire that wasn't there the last time I'd looked. A long afternoon of silence, the kind that's not uncomfortable, where 2 people are each doing their own thing in the same space and neither one of them minds. Her wrists, which were healing, the bruising had gone from purple to that ugly yellow-brown that means the body is winning. Going back to Ocotillo Wells on the 3rd day, and finding 3 wires from Marsh waiting. The first said the county clerk had found 2 instruments. The original filing under Tate's name, which was clean and clear, and a second instrument filed 9 weeks after Tate's death, claiming the claim had lapsed for non-payment of the annual validation fee. The second wire said Marsh had checked the validation fee schedule, and the fee was not due until January and Tate had died in March, which meant the second instrument had been filed against a fee that hadn't yet come due and was, in Marsh's word, fabricated. The third wire said, "I am coming, arrive Thursday." I came back from Ocotillo Wells a different man than I'd left. I want to be careful about saying that because it sounds like the kind of thing a man says to make himself sound significant. What I mean is, for 2 years I had been thin. I said that before, paper in the sun. And somewhere between riding to the ford in the dark and standing in that telegraph office reading Marsh's 3 wires, I'd started to feel the weight of myself again. Not pride, exactly. More like gravity, the sensation of having a particular place on the ground to stand on. I rode back to camp and told Celia about the wires. She listened. Her face did not change much while I told it, but her hands did. They went still in a particular way, the way a person's hands go still when they've been holding something very heavy for a long time, and someone has just told them they can set it down. When I finished, she said, "He'll come in force before Thursday." "Yes," I said. "He'll have heard about the wires." "Can we hold the bench for 2 days?" "That depends on how many he brings." She thought about that. Then she said, "I know 2 men, brothers. They have a small place in the lower valley. They have no love for Raftercay. Cordell ran their cousin off a Gray's claim 2 years back. They might ride if asked." "Ask them," I said. She went that afternoon on the gray, which she rode as well as I did, and maybe with less argument from the horse. She came back at dusk with the 2 brothers, whose names were Esteban and Rodolfo Fuentes, who were somewhere in their 40s and wore their hats low and didn't say much, but shook my hand with the kind of grip that means something. They'd brought their own rifles and their own food, and they asked no questions I couldn't answer honestly. We went over the map. Cordell came on Wednesday, which was a day earlier than I'd thought. I'll tell you what happened without decoration, because it doesn't need any. There were 9 of them. They came up the north draw in the middle of the morning, which is the approach the map showed as the easiest, which is why I was waiting there with Esteban Fuentes while Rodolfo covered the east face, and Celia held the high ground on the bench rim with the extra rifle. They stopped when I stood up from behind the rock I was behind. Cordell was in the center. Daylight didn't improve him. "This is your last chance," he said. "Last chance for what?" I said. "To walk away clean." "The claim is legal," I said. "We have a lawyer coming from Tucson with the instrument proof. The second filing is fraudulent. You know that, I know that. Your men know it too, even if they won't say." One of the men in the back, young, 19 maybe, on a sorrel horse, shifted in the saddle. Cordell said, "Your lawyer won't make it if he runs into trouble on the road." And that was the moment. When a man says a thing like that out loud with 9 riders behind him, he's made a decision. He's decided that there is no version of this that stays quiet. He's decided to let you know he means to take everything. I said, "He's already in Ocotillo Wells. He arrived last night. He's at the hotel, which has 3 other guests who have met him. He's already sent 2 wires. One to his office, one to the territorial marshal." That wasn't strictly true about the marshal, but the rest of it was. Cordell's jaw moved. "Furthermore," I said, "there are 2 more rifles on this bench that you can't see, which means if this goes wrong you will take fire from 3 directions, and the high ground is not yours." The young man on the sorrel horse was the first to turn his horse around. Not fast, just around. And then one of the men to Cordell's left did the same, and then 2 more. Cordell sat there for a good long time looking at me with his town coat and his certainty, and whatever was behind his eyes that men like him have behind their eyes. I looked back. He turned his horse. They went down the draw, and I watched them until I couldn't see the dust anymore. Marsh arrived at noon. He was a small man, thin as a fence rail, with a brown suit and wire-rimmed glasses and a leather case that looked like it had been in some weather. He looked at the bench, looked at the stock tank, looked at the frame house. "Good land," he said. "Yes," I said. He spread his documents on a flat rock and went through them with Celia, explaining each one in terms she could hold and use. I stood back and let them work. The Fuentes brothers had already ridden home. There was nothing left for them here. It took about 2 hours. At the end of it, Marsh said the fraudulent filing could be challenged and would very likely be set aside in a territorial court, that the original instrument was clean, and that Celia Vasquez had a strong case for heirship through documented cohabitation and Tate's declared intent, which several people in Ocotillo Wells had apparently heard him express in the weeks before he died. He also said, with the particular dryness of a man who has been doing this long enough, that he expected Cordell's company to quietly withdraw rather than take this to a judge. He was right. We found out 6 weeks later they withdrew. I stayed on to help finish the roof. That's not a metaphor. The frame house needed a roof, and I knew how to cut and lay shingles, and Celia's arm was still not fully right, and the work went faster with 2. Esteban Fuentes came by one afternoon and helped with the ridge line, which required 3 people, and then went home again. We didn't talk about what was going to happen after. We just worked. There was something in that, in the simple physics of 2 people building a thing together, that said more than talking would have. One evening, about a week in, I was up on the frame laying a course of shingles, and she handed them up to me from below. And when I reached down for the next one, she held on to it a second longer than needed and looked up at me and said, "You know you can stay." I looked at her. "I'm not asking out of debt," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm asking because I think you're a man who's been moving so long he's forgotten he's allowed to stop." I didn't say anything for a moment. The wind came across the bench, and it smelled like the stock tank and the high timber. "You'd have to tolerate some things," I said. "Such as?" "I have a temper with stupid men." "I've seen your temper with stupid men," she said. "I found it useful." I almost smiled. I'm not sure I did, but I almost did. "I'm not going to be easy to be around all the time," I said. "Neither am I," she said. She looked at the shingle in her hand and then back up at me. We could try being hard to be around together and see how that goes. I sat up there on the frame for a moment with the late sun flat and long across the bench and the valley falling away below us in its stages of red and brown and pale green, and I thought about 2 years of moving, about what I'd been before I stopped being it, about a woman who'd been wired to a post in the dark by men who thought she didn't matter, and who hadn't made a sound when she heard a stranger coming because she'd learned to read things before they declared themselves. I reached down for the next shingle. "All right," I said. That was it. That was the whole thing, all right. We finished the roof the following Thursday. Marsh had sent the filed paperwork by then, and the claim was in Celia's name, clean and recorded. The frame house had 4 walls and a good roof, and a door that hung true. I drove the last nail just before the light went, came down off the roof, and she handed me a cup of coffee, and we stood at the edge of the bench in the cooling down of the day and looked at what we'd built. I was not a young man. I didn't have illusions about that. My hands were not what they used to be, and my back told me the weather 3 days out, and there was a scar on my left forearm that pulled in the cold. I had been a deputy and then nothing in particular, and then, apparently, this. She was standing close enough that her shoulder was against my arm. She didn't make anything of it, and neither did I. We just stood there with our coffee and looked at the bench and the valley, and the last light spreading itself thin and orange across the rim rock. She said, "I used to think land only mattered as land, the practical weight of it." I said, "And now? Now I think it also matters as proof." I thought about that. Proof of what? She was quiet for a moment. That you were here, that you stood somewhere and held it. The light was almost gone. The stock tank caught the last of it and gave it back as a single pale streak on the water. I have spent a good number of years since that evening on this bench. The house has a second room now and a proper chimney. The stock tank has never gone dry. I know every feature of this land the way you know the face of someone you've looked at in all kinds of light. I don't know how to account for what I am now compared to what I was. I know I stopped being thin. I know that there is a woman who chose this particular ground and this particular man to stand on it with her, who did not need saving and did not need carrying, and who made that choice with her eyes open and her arms uncrossed. The wire I took from her wrists is still in my saddlebag. I have never taken it out. I'm not sure why I keep it, except that it was the last thing someone else put on her, and it is the last thing anyone will.